The Sydney Monorail was one of Sydney's most iconic public transport systems. It ran for 8 kilometres around Sydney's CBD, with stations located all over the city. And yet, the system was tragically closed down in 2013.
But why? What went wrong for the Sydney Monorail? Widely considered easily the most successful piece of infrastructure Sydney has ever built. Why does it no longer exist? I'm Shareth and welcome to Building Beautifully.
Very few know that the Sydney Monorail was actually first proposed all the way back in 1962 by then Prime Minister Harold Holt, who envisioned 46 stations spread out across 4 lines, including a line up to Watson's Bay. Residents of the eastern suburbs, who are known to be very accepting of infrastructure that makes their areas more accessible, advocated strongly for the monorail to be built, but these plans never went through. We did try to get in touch with Harold Holt for comment, but his office told us he still hadn't gotten back from his swim.
Alternatives to monorail were briefly considered, but ultimately the advantages of monorail were just far too promising to ignore. Compared to trains, monorail cost half the price, carry up to twice as many passengers, are up to 4 times as fast, 10 times as comfortable, and require no maintenance at all.
As for why we didn't build light rail instead, Sydney's current light rail system breaks down almost daily. Monorails famously never break down.
Now, most projects in Sydney face a lot of public backlash. The monorail was no different, except that it was. The Sydney Monorail famously faced no public backlash at all. People recognised that the monorail would be shiny and futuristic, and provide a silvery contrast to such old, bleak and dull buildings as QVB.
The monorail finally opened on April 1st, 1970, to much fanfare. The monorail was an instant hit, and a survey conducted by the Sydney Morning Herald showed that 81% of Sydneysiders loved the monorail. We can all agree that the remaining 38% were just stupid. It was predicted that 12 million trips would be made on the monorail a year, but indeed these estimates were quite wrong. 120 million trips were made on the monorail in July 1970 alone.
One of the monorail's old stations was located right here at Harbourside. Now, the station's body remains in place even to this day, over 10 years after the monorail inexplicably closed. But did you know that this was not the only monorail station on the network? Obviously. Don't be stupid, you c***. There was also a monorail station right here at Chinatown in the bustling and alive 1 Dixon Street shopping centre. In fact, this station was the busiest station on the network. It was so busy that its opening hours were restricted to weekdays from 7 to 9 AM, as otherwise there would have been too many people using the station. Postmodern urban planning ideals dictate that we must try to restrict public transport usage as much as possible, and instead encourage car dependence. Cars are great for the environment, and they're small, shiny and sexy. Trains could never.
Since the monorail was so popular, an extension was proposed, with new stops at King Street Wharf, East Darling Harbour South, East Darling Harbour South West, North East Darling Harbour North South, and North East West Darling Harbour North North East. Indeed, it's not known to many, but the cutaway at Barangaroo is actually a ghost station. This space was initially cut out in order to fit a monorail station. Fortunately, what was built in this area instead was just as unanimously cherished as the monorail.
Even though the entire nation loved the Sydney Monorail, it did have some flaws. It was too fast. It was too convenient. It never broke down. It was too well integrated with surrounding public transport options, and its tickets were far too cheap. We can see many apartments have been built around the former Harbourside Monorail station. This is not good. On this channel, I regularly denounce this form of development. We should try not to maximise access to stations to as many people as possible, but rather restrict access to a select special few. After all, that's what they do at my favourite station in Sydney, Denniston.
The monorail was perhaps a victim of its own success. It was so universally loved by Sydneysiders that they started to not want to use any other form of transport. The New South Wales Liberal government, who could not stand to see how successful a Labor project had been, subsequently closed the monorail on April 1st, 2013. The monorail's closure was the greatest crime ever committed against the electorate. The transport minister from that government went on to be investigated for corruption, and I don't want to suggest that this investigation pertained to her choice to tear down the monorail, but this investigation definitely pertained to her choice to tear down the monorail.
The Sydney Monorail was, without a doubt, the single greatest gift to man Sydney has ever created. If you were lucky enough to travel on the monorail, I hope you were grateful for this experience, as there are now 0 monorails remaining in the world. I hope that you treasure this memory, as the monorail will now forever remain lost to time. Oh, and for those of you who still haven't figured it out, check the date this video was uploaded and have a happy April Fools. Ugh, f*** me dead, that took forever. Can we go home now? Why does anyone watch this boring shit?